For most of human history, the West was not the center of the world. In fact, if you walked into a library in Paris in the year 1000, you would find almost nothing. Meanwhile, in China, they were already printing books by the tens of thousands. How did the gap become so wide, and why did a simple material change the trajectory of two civilizations? To understand the difference, we have to look at the storage of human thought. In Europe, during the early Middle Ages, books were written on parchment or vellum. These were made from the dried skins of sheep, goats, or calves. A single book, like a Bible, required the skins of an entire herd of animals. It was physically impossible to have a mass market literature when each copy cost more than a small house. If you wanted to study, you had to travel to a monastery, beg for a look at a chained book, and copy it by hand. Information was a luxury good, guarded by the elite. Now, look at China. By the 2nd century, they had mastered the secret of paper. Cai Lun, a court official, is traditionally credited with refining the process in 105 AD. He used mulberry bark, hemp, and rags, turning them into a pulp that could be pressed into thin, durable sheets. Unlike animal skin, paper was cheap, light, and incredibly easy to produce. By the Tang Dynasty, roughly 600 to 900 AD, China had entered a golden age of literacy. Because paper was cheap, people started printing. They didn't just write by hand, they invented woodblock printing. They carved entire pages of text into blocks of wood, inked them, and stamped them onto paper. In 868 AD, they produced the Diamond Sutra. It is the world's oldest dated printed book. It wasn't a one-off project. Thousands of copies were printed and distributed. Compare that to Europe, where it would take another 600 years for Gutenberg to arrive. This technological head start allowed China to build a massive centralized bureaucracy. You cannot run an empire that spans millions of square miles without paper. They used it for tax records, legal codes, maps, and civil service exams. If you wanted a government job in China, you had to pass a rigorous exam based on Confucian classics. This created a meritocratic system where the smartest people in the country were the ones running it. They were reading, writing, and debating in a way that Europeans simply could not fathom. In Europe, the literacy rate was likely below 5% for centuries. In China, by the Song dynasty in the 11th century, it was reaching into the double digits. That difference is the difference between a dark age and a golden age. But why did it stay that way for 1,000 years? Geography played a role, but the main factor was the medium itself. Europe's dependence on vellum acted as a firewall against the spread of ideas. It kept knowledge concentrated in the hands of the church and the nobility. It created a static society where information was a tool of control, not a tool for growth. In China, the abundance of paper created a feedback loop of innovation. Poets wrote, scientists documented their experiments, and merchants kept detailed ledgers. The printing industry became a commercial powerhouse. By the year 1200, you could buy printed calendars, medical textbooks, and encyclopedias in almost any major Chinese market. When Marco Polo finally arrived in China in the late 13th century, he was baffled. He saw paper money being used as currency, a concept that didn't exist in Europe. He saw a society that operated with a level of complexity that made the kingdoms of Europe look like disorganized backwaters. He tried to explain the concept of paper money to his peers back in Venice, but they thought he was lying. They couldn't conceive of a piece of paper having actual, regulated, state-backed value. So, why did Europe eventually catch up? The answer lies in the slow, agonizing process of importing the secret. Paper-making technology moved along the Silk Road, through the Islamic world, and finally into Spain and Italy by the 12th and 13th centuries. It took roughly a millennium for the technique to cross the continent. But even then, Europe hit a wall. They had the paper, but they lacked the cultural infrastructure to use it. They were still copying books by hand. It wasn't until the mid 1400s, when Gutenberg combined paper with the movable type press and oil based inks, that Europe finally broke the barrier. Once they did, the floodgates opened. The Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution were all direct consequences of cheap, accessible paper. The gap between China and Europe wasn't about intelligence or religion or race. It was about the cost of information. When information is expensive, power remains concentrated. When information is cheap, power becomes distributed. When we look back at those 1,000 years, we aren't just looking at the history of paper. We are looking at the history of how humans process their own potential. A society that keeps its knowledge on animal skin will always be smaller, slower, and more fragile than a society that keeps its knowledge on paper. Today, we are living through another shift. Paper is fading, replaced by digital data that costs essentially zero to replicate. We are currently in the most information dense period in human history. But as we look at the screens in our hands, we have to ask ourselves, are we using this new infinite storage for progress, or have we just found a new way to build our own metaphorical stone walls? The history of paper reminds us that technology never moves in a straight line. It accelerates, it plateaus, and sometimes it leaves entire civilizations behind. The question for the next 1,000 years is not how much we can store, but what we will choose to print, save, and remember.